Number 10. Gigantia. Located in Malta's Gojo Island, Gigantia is among the world's oldest freestanding structures. It predates Stonehenge and the Egyptian pyramids, so it's pretty old. Discovered in the early 19th century, these megalithic temples date back to 3600 to 3200 BC. According to local mythology, the temples were built by giants, hence the name Gigantia, which translates to giantess tower. Now, the legend behind this fascinating ancient site tells us of a giantess who, after eating red beans, bore a child and then built these temples herself. Now, the way the story is told, the giant had to hold on to her child the entire time, so this giant had to have built this all with one arm. That's super impressive. I can't even hold my arm up in class for longer than 5 minutes, let alone build a temple. That's amazing. The site reflects the architectural and artistic prowess of Malta's prehistoric people. Now, many historians are of course baffled because, as beautiful as this sounds, I don't know one person who could do this, giant or not. That's why many believe that these ancient civilizations had some sort of aid by either extraterrestrials or some sort of advanced technology that we have not found yet. So yeah, hot start, there we go. Number 9, Nadol. Our next stop is an ancient city off Pohnpei's coast in Micronesia. The city consists of nearly 100 artificial islets constructed on top of coral reefs. Yeah, we're trying to save our coral reefs. Meanwhile, back in the day, they were building stuff on top of them. That's rather impressive and terrifying. Its architecture is significant because the structures, built between the 13th and the 17th centuries, they utilized massive basalt logs, showcasing early engineering abilities. Now, the origins and construction of Nadol remain subjects of debate. Some theories suggest external influence or, again, ancient technology, which is why it's on our list today. Others can argue local ingenuity, probably more likely than aliens, but it's all speculation regardless. We still have no clue how this was done. Local mythology speaks of twin sorcerers, Alishpa and Aloshpa, who with spiritual assistance levitated the massive stones. Honestly, that makes the most sense. I couldn't, no. 10 of me couldn't lift one of those, no way. Number 8, the Great Pyramid of Cholula. If you're ever going to Mexico for a trip with your friends or whatever, convince everybody to go off resort for one day and go see the Great Pyramid. You can miss one pool party, all right? It's just one time. The Great Pyramid of Cholula is the largest pyramid in terms of volume. And yes, that means that it's even larger than Egypt's Great Pyramid of Giza. Now, the pyramid was believed to have been constructed in 4 stages, starting from the 3rd century BC. Its exact age remains debated. Historically, it was a religious and mythical center dedicated to the deity Quetzalcoatl. Now, over time, layers were added by following cultures, one on top of another, eventually being covered in vegetation entirely. Now, cut to the most recent times when the Spanish arrived. Instead of demolishing it, they built a church of Our Lady of Remedies on top. At this point, they were still unaware of the pyramid's full extent. Now, local legends suggest the pyramid was built by giants or gods. Another popular belief is that it holds a vast network of tunnels or a hidden chamber, so whoever's hiding in there, they buried themselves quite deep. It's not bad, we're never gonna find it. Number 7, Cart Ruts, Malta. Cart Ruts in Malta are on a much smaller scale than the Great Pyramid, but these mysterious parallel groves found in limestone plateaus have a big story to tell. The tracks are believed to date back to the Bronze Age. They were discovered in the 19th century, and their exact purpose is still uncertain, of course. But we have theories ranging from transportation to ritualistic use. All that in just 2 little tracks. Look at that. Maltese folklore sometimes attributes these tracks to giants dragging their boats. Now, the tracks run through solid rock. That's the fascinating part here. It's not soft clay. It wasn't once soft clay. It is solid rock. Always has been. This adds to the mystery of these 2,700-year-old tracks. Natural or man-made? We still have no idea, so it's impossible to conclude their purpose. What do you guys think? Comment down below. And while you're down there, hit that thumbs up. You know what I mean? We're having a good time. We're almost halfway done. You love the channel, we love you, show some love. Number 6, Malta Temples, Malta. Another ancient Maltese site, 2 in a row. How lucky are we? Malta Temples are located in Malta's southern coast, and together these buildings form an impressive megalithic complex. Dating from anywhere from 3,600 years ago to 2,500 BC. Now, as if the design wasn't fascinating enough, you'll be surprised to know these buildings would provide insight into Malta's prehistoric period, with features aligned to celestial events. Okay. Local legends, influenced by the temple's monumental size, suggest that they were constructed by, you guessed it, giants, or by using mystical means. Aliens, I guess that's what that one means. The blend of real history and mythology surrounding Menagera showcases the enduring allure of Malta's ancient past. I wish I could just glimpse into the past, just a little quick peek, that's it. I won't help because I'm not a giant, so I'm just gonna watch, but that's it, just a quick peek. Number 5, the Ghostex Circle. Since we're all looking into the cosmos for answers, let us now take a look at the Ghostex Circle. It's not a great pyramid ascending towards the gods, it's actually rather simple. The Ghostex Circle was discovered in 1991 when archaeologists were conducting a routine aerial circle around the town of Ghostex, Germany. Now they saw below them an undiscovered 75-meter wide circle cut through at 3 different points. Now when excavation began later in 2002, they discovered these carved circular rings were aligned with the sunset and sunrise. So many believe this was an ancient solar observatory, but considering the fact that the Ghostex Circle dates back to 4900 BC during the European Neolithic, this means that this ring is older than the Egyptian pyramids. That's fascinating. When I was in school, they always talked about the pyramids being the oldest thing from ancient humans. It's like, no, you missed about 10, actually. The discovery of a headless skeleton with deliberate cuts in their bones also suggests that this may have been a place of sacrifice. Yeah, yikes. It was beautiful, but it was also kind of disgusting. Beautiful on top and disgusting on bottom, I guess. I don't know. Number 4, the Yanagi Monument. Grab your goggles for this next one because we're going diving. The Yanagi Monument, submerged near Japan's Ryukyu Islands, is a mysterious underwater site with sandstone structures, columns, and even a stepped pyramid. Not natural at all. No way, I don't believe that. It was discovered off Yanaguni's coast, and its origin, natural or man-made, it sparks quite the debate. Some experts believe that its formation was caused by seismic activities, suggesting earthquakes or erosion crafted this unique shape. However, Professor Masaki Kimura argues that its precise carvings, sharp angles, and distinct holes indicate human craftsmanship, which is pretty amazing. He dates it back to 2,000 years ago, speculating that it might be remnants of the lost Mu civilization. 2,000 years old, those carvings, and it truly is a head scratcher. Do you believe the Yanagi Monument is made of natural formation, or did humans make this a long time ago? Comment down below your theories, because I have no idea. That's why I'm asking you. Number 3, the Bimini Islands. While we're in the ocean, let's swim on over to the Bahamas and check out Bimini Road. Now this road is a submerged rock formation one could easily miss. Looks quite normal compared to everything else on the list here. Some believe it's remnants of the lost city of Atlantis, as popularized by psychic Edgar Case's predictions, but local legends and local tales often link these linear stones to ancient advanced civilizations. Bimini Road has been associated with the lost civilization of Atlantis since the 1960s, and it's been well explored since. The main argument here is that the Bimini structure is human-made, and that it's composed of evenly sized and evenly distributed square blocks of rock. Also, 90-degree angles on all these cuts. Nature doesn't do that. Nature does not give you 90-degree angles. The blend of mythology and reality around Bimini Road and the fact that it's in the ocean, 3 for 3 right there. It has experts desperate for answers. Number 2, the Sajama Lions. The Sajama Lions were rediscovered in the 1930s in the Sajama Natural Park in Bolivia. Now it's a massive network of straight lines and geometric shapes, and it's stretching over 20 kilometers over the surrounding landscape. This is our biggest one on the list. This looks like a crater on the moon almost. There's lines shooting out of it. It almost looks like some sort of ancient highway. I don't know. It's really hard to look at. Maybe I'm crazy, but we're at number 2, okay? Let's get weird for the last parts. Some experts believe that the Sajama Lions were used for astronomical observation as they are aligned with the movements of the sun, moon, and the stars. That's both impressive and terrifying, right? Is this like some UFO airport? What am I looking at right now? And finally, number 1, the Atacama Giant. We've been talking about giants all day. Let's just finish with the biggest one, all right? This massive geoglyph is located in the Atacama Desert of Chile, and it looks like an alien doodle. I love this little guy. He looks kind of friendly. I'd say what's up, shake his hand. It's a large human-like figure that measures 86 meters in height and is believed to have been created by the pre-Columbian peoples who inhabited the area over 1,000 years ago. Now, the figure's arms are raised and its body is decorated with symbols and designs that are thought to have religious or astronomical significance. Imagine finding this one day hundreds of years ago. That would be quite jarring. What am I looking at right now? The purpose of this geoglyph, of course, remains a mystery.
At number 10, population. It's pretty messed up just how many slaves there were in ancient Rome. In their society, wealthy people owned dozens if not hundreds of slaves to do their menial work. In ancient Rome, anyone could be sold into slavery. No matter your race or background, if you could work, you could be bought and sold. Historians believe that about 90% of the free people in Italy by the 1st century BCE had ancestors who were slaves. At one point, the Roman Senate debated having slaves wear uniforms to be able to distinguish them from the rest of society, but they ultimately decided against it when they realized just how many slaves there were. One ancient Roman politician once said, quote, "It was once proposed in the Senate that slaves should be distinguished from free people by their dress, but then it was realized how great a danger this would be if our slaves began to count us." End quote. They literally couldn't afford to let the slaves know how many other slaves there were, because if they would have known they outnumbered the other members of society, this could have led to a revolt. I mean, there were slave revolts regardless, but we will get to that later. At number 9, lifestyle. Ancient Roman slaves experienced different lifestyles and living conditions based on a number of factors, often linked to their occupations. Slaves who didn't have a specific skill or trade were often used in mines and agriculture, and those were the harshest conditions that they could have been subjected to. Oftentimes, they were literally worked to death, and since they didn't have any human rights in the eyes of the Romans, they were often overlooked and simply replaced. On the other hand, household slaves received more humane treatment. They were treated better by their masters, and sometimes they were able to get some money in order to buy their freedom. If they were able to buy their freedom, the slaves would become freedmen, which was a social class between slaves and free people. Before we continue discussing the hard lives of slaves in ancient Rome, make sure you guys smash that thumbs up button if you're thoroughly entertained so far, and maybe even consider subscribing to the channel to see more videos like this one. At number 8, Spartacus. At one point, a group of Roman slaves revolted, and though they eventually lost their battle, they survived a pretty long time thanks to one famous slave named Spartacus. Spartacus was a slave who escaped a gladiatorial training camp and recruited thousands of other slaves to fight for their freedom alongside him. For the slaves, Spartacus was their symbol of hope and their leader. This slave army was able to defy Roman authorities for 2 years with freedom in their sights, but unfortunately those dreams were crushed when Roman general Crassus crushed Spartacus and his army. After Spartacus was killed, the authorities came for the rest of the slaves in the army, and they were severely punished. 6,000 slaves who took part in the revolt were crucified, and this was almost a warning to the other slaves against trying to revolt again. Spartacus became a legend, but it wasn't enough to free the Roman slaves. At number 7, ownership. In ancient Rome, slavery and slave ownership was such a common practice that pretty much everyone owned slaves, regardless of social status. Even some of the poorest Roman citizens would own 1 or 2 slaves. Obviously, the more money you had back then, the more slaves you could afford. In Roman Egypt, the average artisan owned about 2 or 3 slaves each. Emperor Nero was known to have owned over 400 slaves who lived and worked in his home in the city, but his numbers are eclipsed by a wealthy Roman named Gaius Caecilius Isidorus, who according to historical records owned 4,166 slaves at the time of his death. That just gives you an idea of just how many people were sold into slavery in the first place. At number 6, freedom. Earlier I mentioned that Roman slaves had the chance to buy their freedom. It was a lengthy process, but this gave a lot of slaves hope for a better life. Things weren't always better after buying their freedom though, and many of them sold themselves back into slavery because things were tough. The process of buying your freedom as a slave was called manumission. This could be achieved in a number of ways. Slave master could grant their slave freedom as a reward for their service and loyalty. The slave could pay their master a sum of money to be freed, or sometimes a slave master could just find it convenient to let their slave go. Most slave masters who chose that last option to free their slave for their own benefit were merchants who needed someone to be able to sign contracts on their behalf, and since slaves weren't allowed to represent their masters from a legal standpoint, they would be freed, but would still work for their master. You also had to be over the age of 30 to buy your freedom, so if you were lucky to live that long, then there was hope of being freed, but with the average life expectancy in ancient Rome being about 28 years or so, and with the living conditions of many slaves, they would be lucky to get that opportunity. At number 5, demand. In ancient Rome, there was an incredibly high demand for slaves, but since there were so many slaves in Rome, there was always work for them. Oftentimes, people sold themselves or their children into slavery in order to pay off their debts, so when it came to being bought, that came pretty easy. Other than public office, slaves were used for almost every activity in ancient Rome. The most common slave trade was mining because workers were always in demand, mostly due to the high level of danger that came with the job, and the fact that many slaves were injured or died while working in the mines, and slave masters needed to keep replacing those who could no longer work. Domestic labor and farming were also high demand jobs for slaves back then. Back then, the law logic behind using slave labor for these types of jobs was that, quote, free labor should be used in unhealthy places, end quote. Basically, they believed that it was better to have a slave pass away on the job than a free person because it would impact their business less. At number 4, procurement. The way that slaves were acquired in ancient Rome was pretty messed up, I will say. Typically, slaves were acquired through 4 different ways. They would be brought in as war captives, as victims of pirate raids, by trade, or by breeding. During the early expansion of the Roman Empire, many war captives were turned into slaves. The pirates from Sicilia, located in what is now modern-day Turkey, did business with the Romans and supplied them with a lot of their slaves. The pirates would bring their slaves to the island of Delos, which back then was considered to be the international center of slave trading. The slave trade was such a big deal back then that it has been recorded that on at least one occasion, 10,000 people were traded as slaves and shipped back to Italy in one day. This was a big business opportunity for a lot of people, but of course no one ever considered the lives of the people they were buying and selling. At number 3, fugitives. As you can imagine, life as a slave in ancient Rome, or at any period of time, wasn't easy. Living conditions were poor, it was dangerous, and no one should ever be treated like that or used for free labor. Many slaves have been known to escape, and obviously the same went for those in ancient Rome. Slaves running away from their masters was a common thing back then, and to deal with it, slave owners would hire professional slave catchers to hunt down, capture, and return the escaped slave back to their owner. For slave owners who wanted to take matters into their own hands, they would advertise rewards for those who could return their slaves, or they would just try and locate their slave themselves. Some slave owners had ways of preventing their slaves from getting away, like using collars with instructions on where to return the escaped slave, much like a dog collar, which is just dehumanizing. At number 2, revolts. In Roman times, slave revolts were pretty common. There have been a number of recorded slave revolts in Roman history. I mentioned the one that was led by Spartacus, but there's another pretty famous Roman slave revolt that was led by a man named Eunice. Eunice led a revolt that happened in Sicily from 135 to 132 BCE. It is said that Eunice believed himself to be a prophet and claimed to have several mystical visions. Eunice was able to persuade a number of other slaves to follow him when he performed a trick where sparks and flames came out of his mouth. They believed that he was magical, and so they followed him to try and fight back against the Roman forces. Unfortunately, they were defeated, but the example that they set is believed to have inspired yet another slave revolt in Sicily later in 104 to 103 BCE. And finally, at number 1, totally normal. Probably the most messed up thing about life as a Roman slave was just how normal slavery was in society. I mean, the Roman people were so invested in their slaves that they continuously tried to crush their revolts, and they tried everything in their power to keep them from escaping. Even the sheer number of slaves that were in their society just shows how important slavery was to them. Back then, slavery was just an unquestioned institution. For many, it was just a normal part of life, which is actually quite frightening when you think about it. There is no recorded history of Romans ever questioning slavery in their society, and all economic, legal, and social forces in Rome at this time worked hard to try and preserve slavery as part of their society. To the ancient Romans, slaves were seen as the direct opposite of free people, which they believed was a necessary balance that they needed in their society. They never completely got rid of slavery either. Though they did try and create new rules and laws to make life as a slave more bearable, they were still bought and sold into servitude and were seen as property and lesser people. At number 10, veil. Through this video, you will come to find out that a lot of the wedding traditions that we practice these days have some pretty messed up origins. We'll get through a lot of them throughout this list, but let's start off by talking about the bride's veil. These days, a lot of brides choose to wear a veil on their wedding day. With so many different styles to choose from, this accessory is known to add that extra little pizzazz, little spice to the look. But throughout history, veils were used for different things, some of them being a tad bit messed up. Just a smidge. The rather obvious reason for brides to wear a veil back in the day had to do with religion and staying modest. But this hasn't been the only reason for veils. In ancient Rome, brides wore veils because it was believed to be effective at warding off evil spirits. The most messed up reason for the veil though, at least in my opinion anyway, has to do with the wedding transaction, so to speak. Since back in the olden days, marrying your daughter off was seen as more of a transaction, brides would wear veils to cover their faces, and they wouldn't be lifted until after they were proclaimed husband and wife, so that the groom wouldn't be able to back out if he didn't like how his bride looked. Seems pretty messed up to me, but what are your thoughts on it? Tell us down in the comments.
Number 9, when doves cry. I've been to one wedding where they released doves, like actual real life doves. And I was like, do they actually do this? I couldn't believe my eyes. I didn't know it was a real thing. Why do we do this? Well, because doves mate for life and they build a nest and then they Netflix and chill until the end of their dove days. Sounds like perfect symbolism if I've ever heard it. Back in ancient Roman and Greek times, doves were often used as gifts from the bride to the groom. Pretty shitty gift if you ask me. Here's a bird that we now have to both take care of. The snow white ring-necked dove is used by magicians. They can't fly too well, they don't have a homing instinct, whereas rock doves, the ones commonly used in weddings that we see fly away over Nana's head, they have a homing instinct for hundreds of miles, so they're perfect for the gig. But they couldn't be released during foul weather and they needed 2 hours before the sun sets in order for them to fly home. The wedding band has less rules than the doves. That's amazing. Their rider is much smaller. If you were to catch one of these doves at a wedding, you were also allowed to keep it back in the day. Also, great hands. I don't know who's catching birds or why they want to keep it and put it in their pocket, but you do you.
At number 8, best man. These days, the role of the best man normally goes to the guy who's closest to the groom, whether that's a brother or a best friend. But back during the time where women were married off like property, the role of the best man was very different and was all about protecting one's assets. Back then, bride napping was actually very common, so if there was someone else who wanted to marry someone who was already promised to another person, they might try and steal her away for themselves. Yeah, why? I don't know. This is where the best man came in. The best man's job was to protect the bride, and if she was stolen, the best man would be the one to enter whatever battle or duel was necessary to get the bride back. The best man was literally there to be the best fighter. The best man was also there to watch over the bride to make sure that she didn't try and make a run for it herself. They really said, try to derail this wedding and see what happens.
Number 7, a June wedding. As we're counting down this list slowly but surely, you've probably begun fantasizing maybe about your own wedding one day. Maybe it's a beach wedding, maybe it's themed like a winter wonderland. Doesn't that sound cozy? It's your big day, get creative. They say the best month to get married is June, and from a Canadian point of view, I can absolutely agree with that. In ancient Roman times, however, getting married in June was a must, not just a thing you wanted to do. See, June was the month of the god Juno. They protect women in life when it comes to marriage and childbirth, so if it's between that and like, I don't know, Halloween, obviously we're gonna go with June. Better omens for sure. Another myth is that bathing was rarely done back then, so when majority of the population did finally, wash up at the end of May or beginning of June, that's often when it would happen. Everybody smelled nice, they felt good, and they wanted to celebrate. So it was perfect timing. Better get me while my pits smell good, you know? That's a myth, but I can also see it checking out. A June wedding in ancient Roman days was also done so that after a spring birth, the mother can quickly hop back into action and help with that summer's harvest. Maternity leave who? Never heard of her.
At number 6, hashtag twinning. You know how at weddings the bridesmaids are usually wearing matching outfits? Well, this tradition dates back centuries, though it has changed slightly over the years. Remember how I mentioned that people would sometimes try to kidnap the bride on her wedding day? Well, other than the best man and the groomsmen trying to play their part in protecting the bride from being taken, the bridesmaids also played a part in that too. The bridesmaids used to dress identically to the bride so that it would make it harder to spot her and therefore prevent anyone from kidnapping her. This practice dates all the way back to ancient Rome and feudal China and didn't really start to fade out of tradition until around the 1880s. These days you get a couple of gifts from the bride for being in her posse, but back then you didn't get anything and you had to risk your safety for your girl Becky, who doesn't even want to marry Jeff down the block. I don't know.
Number 5, a toast. My favorite part of a wedding has to be the speeches or the toasts. They're always way too long or too personal or you know what, just too depressing. Just way too sad, just tears. You're like, why? Why are we talking about this? It's a nerve-wracking part, even as a guest, just to get up randomly and be like, okay, look at me everyone, hi. No, I don't want to do that. Back in the 1800s though, only men were allowed to give these toasts. The oldest friend, the groom, the best man, and then the father of the bride. The whole thing would have been done in 8 minutes. Guys suck at speeches. They're just like, a lot of ums, that's all I'm saying. Wedding toasts go back as far as the 6th century BC. When Greeks were getting married, the father of the bride would drink the first glass of wine just to make sure it wasn't poisoned or anything. Romans would also drop a piece of burnt toast into the wine in order to make the wine taste less bitter, hence the term toast. Yeah, now we get it. Yeah, wine was so bad back then, they had to use burnt toast Crystal Light just to get through the day. Yuck.
At number 4, transaction. I find it to be just a little little bit messed up how before now marriage was mostly about money or status and not about love. For a long time, people didn't get to choose who they got to marry, and there was almost always some kind of monetary transaction involved in the wedding. This whole idea here is a reason for the traditional act of the bride's father walking her down the aisle and giving her away, so to speak. In the past, fathers of the bride and groom would come together to establish an agreement, like X amount of money for someone's daughter or whatever. Once that was set up, the wedding became a big deal to see if the transaction would actually go through, and many precautions were put in place to make sure that no one backed out. One of those precautions was the act of the father walking his daughter down the aisle. This was done so that they stayed close to one another in the off chance that the groom or his family decided to back out. That really took the romance and sparkle out of weddings now.
Number 3. Wedding cake. As the youngest of 3, I can confirm that we get away with the most. The youngest often do. The middle child is just plain ignored, and then the oldest, well, they usually have the most responsibility in the family. Usually when a bride and groom cut the cake on their big day, it's for them. They save a piece till their anniversary, they put it in their partner's face, it's fun, whatever they want to do. Often in history, the eldest child would get the first slice. How lucky is that? When it came down to cutting the actual cake too, well, that meant that the bride is no longer a virgin. It's an awkward few bites. Wedding cakes today are delicious and they're pretty much an art form. TV shows are devoted to them, like Cake Boss and other cake shows that I can't think of. If you're lucky, you might find a few cake charms on the inside as well back in the day. Real, non-edible cake charms. You wanted to find these in your cake. They brought good omens to the table. To find a rocking chair meant that you're going to live a long life. An anchor means you're bound for adventure, sailors ahoy. And a purse meant that you would have good fortune. Let's just hope you didn't find the charms with your teeth, or else you would be using said new fortune fixing your chiclets. Very metal, very real. Not good.
At number 2, plague flowers. In a lot of weddings, the flowers are very important. There's the flowers for the centerpieces, the bouquets for the bride and bridesmaids, there's flowers everywhere. Get your Benadryl. But why is that? Well, the idea of carrying a bouquet at a wedding dates back to ancient Greece, where it was believed that carrying a bouquet was thought to ward off evil spirits, but a little later on down the line, the presence of bouquets at weddings got a little bit darker and a little more precautionary. During the Middle Ages into the Renaissance, when the Black Death was running rampant throughout Europe, people were trying anything and everything to try and ward off the plague. Back then, people believed that smells carried contagion, so people would fill their pockets with fragrant things to keep the plague at bay. This was later integrated into wedding practices, and brides started carrying around a bouquet of stinky stuff like garlic and dill to protect them from catching anything. Over the years, these stinky stuff was replaced with nice smelling flowers, but really, no one cares what's in the bouquet anymore, because all people want to do is participate in the wedding Hunger Games and fight to the death to catch the bouquet at the end of the night. Why? Why are we hurting each other for this? Why?
And finally, number 1, wedding rings. One ring to rule them all. Perhaps the most important piece of the wedding puzzle, rings. Whenever somebody is about to pop the question, everybody around them always needs to see the ring. Congrats, let me see the ring. Oh my god, is it this? Is it this? Egyptian pharaohs first used rings to represent this eternal life. The circle has no beginning or ending. They created this concept that we adore to this day. The center of the ring was also believed to be the gateway to the unknown. Your finger just disappears, you're like, what the f? These Egyptian Ouroboros rings were the first, a snake eating its own tail, #love. When Greeks came in the picture, they took this tradition, started using copper and iron rings in ceremonies, and the iron rings had a key symbol on them, meaning that the wife now has control of the house. If you like it, then you should have put a key on it. Come medieval times, the ring gets another upgrade. Now we have these precious gems to be added to them, a little bit more glam. Rubies symbolized passion, sapphires symbolized the heavens, and diamonds to show strength, because they were rock hard, and obviously you know the rest. Come the 12th century, the Christian church declared marriage as a holy sacrament, so rings were solely used now for that ceremony. That's when the engagement ring came into place. There needed to be another trade or promise that was just as strong as a wedding band. So now there's rings for pretty much everything.
Number 10. 3 fights and a funeral. This first point is still up for debate, as many historians are still trying to confirm how this whole gladiator thing started, but one possible launching point for these bloody Olympics was a blood rite at funerals. They served as a kind of violent eulogy, so instead of standing up in front of the mourning families and reading, I don't know, like a haiku or a poem, they fought out their feelings. Healthy. When esteemed aristocrats died, families would hold bouts between slaves beside the grave, like right there. front row seat for the corpse. This was to demonstrate the virtues that were demonstrated by the dead in life. This presentation of blood in battle also could have stood in for human sacrifice. As you can guess, the tradition would gather quite the crowd and eventually evolved into the epic gladiator battles we know today. Julius Caesar, for instance, organized a massive gladiator fight between hundreds of warriors to honor the death of his father. By the end of the 1st century BC, the gladiator games were state-funded and much larger.
Number 9. No heckling. When the Colosseum was built in 80 AD, about 50 to 80,000 fans of Roman combat, they would pour in. The energy was high. This was their only source of entertainment, really. They weren't watching The Witcher Season 2 back then, so they had to do this. So some fans would get so into the action that they of course would heckle. Well, just like a comedy show, they too can hear you heckle. You're throwing off their entire performance, and that's a no-go. Today, a 21-year-old usher will politely ask you to keep it down, but in Roman Colosseum days, you don't get a warning. One of Rome's more violent emperors, Domitian, was pretty die-hard when it came to the Colosseum and the games. So much so that one day, a guy in the crowd heckled a gladiator, probably talked smack about his oiled up abs, or smile. That's always a fun one, we hear that a lot. So Domitian had him pulled from the audience to the center of the arena where a group of aggressive dogs finished him off. How terrifying is that? No heckling, ever, even now, stop.
Hey Taylor!
Yeah?
Stop! Number 8, vegetarians. So believe it or not, the diet of a gladiator was largely vegetarian, though it wasn't really like they had any choice. It was expensive to keep these fearsome warriors, and meat wasn't always easy to come by, so they had to fill in the gap with other sources. Based on the excavation of 22 gladiators, their bones revealed that their typical food was wheat, barley, and beans. How they could tell this from their bones, no idea. Science, man. There was little sign of any meat or even dairy as well. However, they did drink another kind of mysterious substance. This study was carried out by the Medical University of Vienna in Austria and the University of Bern in Switzerland. And not only did it reveal the aforementioned vegetarian diets, it also showed evidence that they consumed a health-boosting tonic made out of plant ashes. It can be compared to the way we consume magnesium tablets or vitamin C. It was believed that it helped restore gladiators after a battle. Now obviously 22 is a pretty small sample size, but hey, that's still at least that percentage, so.
Number 7, death before combat. With most of these Roman gladiators, they are trained, they understand a specific style of combat, and they're paired off with an opponent that's somewhat equal. But not all of these gladiators are UFC fighters. Not all of them are Russell Crowe, okay? A great amount of gladiators were criminals who were forced to fight each other in the name of entertainment. These prisoners of war were not really on board with fighting a lion with a dagger. They understood that this was probably a one-way trip, so many of them took their own lives before the combat even began. This one story is haunting, but it makes total sense. 29 prisoners were all set to fight these crazy animal battles in front of thousands, but they all ended up strangling each other. They took each other's lives because that was easier to them than walking into this nightmare. That's horrible. The reason this was an easier choice to make was because saying no would lead to an even more painful and still public execution.
Number 6, aphrodesiac. The fanaticism around gladiator warriors was like the fanfare around the Beatles, the Stones, and Justin Bieber, like all around, all combined. You might even argue that they were some of the very first celebrities, and that was mostly due to their sex appeal. They were sex bombs. Ooh, beefy men. Yeah. Roman women believed that even their sweat was an aphrodisiac, like Old Spice deodorant. The gladiators won massive fame and even had their own action figures, as children would make their clay dolls emanating their favorites. Their image would be placed on walls in public spaces and even endorsed products. Women wore hair jewelry dipped in gladiator blood or mixed their sweat into hair cream or cosmetics. To have a dream about one was said to foretell a fortunate marriage. There was even graffiti in Pompeii that depicted one fighter who would catch women in his nets at night, like a sexy boogeyman. Ooh.
Number 5, blindfolded. Remember that last scene in the movie Dodgeball when Vince Vaughn blindfolds himself and then still wins somehow? What a moment in time. There were no dry eyes in the entire theater. But what if I told you gladiators would also pull this trick off? Yeah, in order to get crowds to return to these massive death events, they would need to change the formula up from time to time. Sometimes they would have cheap beer nights, which helped, but a new idea that worked was referred to as andabata, where gladiators wore blindfolds during combat. They would also leave the armor inside, yeah, sometimes just battling in sandals and cloth. And you thought Marco Polo made you anxious. They would save these events for the more brutal criminals, so people weren't just forced to, wrap up their eyes and shake their legs into an arena. It was, they were bad, so it's kind of like, it was fine, I guess.
Number 4, women fought as gladiators. This was news to me. I wouldn't do it because tiny. As we might have already established, gladiators were usually built from slaves, warriors, and sometimes even volunteers. Good for you. And apparently women were not exempt from that. Female slaves were quite frequently condemned to face their fate in the arena, though some volunteered because, there were Xena warriors. Some of the time it was as genuine contenders, while some were sent simply for the entertainment or embarrassment. Emperor Domitian, for example, loved to pit women against people with dwarfism because he thought it was funny. Neither the women or the little people were taken seriously, as few appeared to have proven themselves in combat. However, some still did, rest assured. The timeline as to when they started doing this is unclear, but there are records of at least 2 women referred to as Amazon and Achillea. Epic names, right? Whoa. They are depicted on a marble relief dating back to the 2nd century AD, and it says that they fought in an honorable draw. Women also joined in the animal hunts, but by 200 AD their participation ended when Emperor Septimus Severus banned them in the games. Damn you, Severus Snape!
Number 3, nets for weapons. When you're walking into that arena, you're eyeing down this 8'6" beast in front of you. He has like 12 abs. It doesn't look good. His name's Gore or something terrifying. You're gonna want a Nerf bat or 2. You're gonna want a weapon. Now, weapons in the Colosseum were a necessity, of course, but can you believe some gladiators would use nets to fight? Nets.
Huh.
Yes. Yeah, nets, like they're catching butterflies or co-hosts. This class was referred to as the Rhetari. Now their combat style was built around the ways of fishermen. Yeah, Popeye versus Maximus, placed your bets, people. Realistically, these warriors looked a lot more like Aquaman. They would fight with a trident and a net. They would take their time. They would avoid these mighty swings from these big dudes, and then when the time was right, they would just go zzz, and then they would just poke the shit out of them with a trident over and over in hopes that it would, end. It helps to be quick, but if you've seen Game of Thrones, you know that spears don't always work.
Number 2, are you not entertained? Great title, I know. Fun fact, gladiators for the most part didn't actually try and kill each other in the ring, just like wound. Yeah. Take a second to digest that beside the Hollywood movies you know and love. But the truth was, gladiators had a code they had to follow, and killing each other wasn't a part of it. Why? Well, because gladiators were expensive investments, and seeing your prize fighter that you've forked hundreds and thousands of dollars into die in a fight would hurt your wallet big time. Also, most of them knew each other and were besties, so they didn't even want to. Contests were usually single combat between 2 even opponents, and referees oversaw the whole thing. If one got injured enough, the ref would probably just, call it. Often enough, the bout would end after both participants gave an entertaining show and would leave with honor. They were like, yeah, you're entertained, good, we're good to go, right? Cool. However, their life expectancy was still short. Historians estimate that gladiators had 1 in 5 or 1 in 10 chance of ending up dead after the bout, either from being killed or wounded, gangrene, the whole deal.
And finally, coming in at number 1 spot, naval battles. Okay, so I mentioned the Aquaman gladiators with the nets and the, pokey poke tridents. That's absolutely insane, but have you heard about the staged naval battles? What a spectacle this would have been. The Colosseum was once flooded, which I'm sure took a hot minute or 2. Then these ships would come out, and then it would be like medieval times, but with a splash zone, right? These ships were designed to resemble these vessels from famous battles, but the bottom of the ship was flat because the water was only 5 feet deep. Can't have the bottom of the ship scraping against all that sand and bones and stuff. No, you'll get stuck. The water was only 5 feet deep, so obviously they couldn't use real ships. It wasn't always violent reenactments either. Sometimes they would fill the Colosseum and nude synchronized swimmers would come out. Nice. Nothing like an in-ground pool filled with gladiator bones. Also, goggles weren't invented until the 14th century, so yuck. These naval battles were doing so well that Emperor Domitian devoted an entire lake to them. It's kind of like Harry Potter Goblet of Fire. They would just go to this lake and then watch these insane battles or performances, Hashtags Slytherin, I don't know. Once the shows moved over there permanently, they then used the floodgates and trapdoors to hide animals inside of. What a nice upgrade. What a show. Also, this is terrifying. Kicking off the list at number 10, A Day in the Life. So as soon as the sun came up, your life as a Civil War soldier began. You would train day in, day out, preparing for battle. It was important that each soldier knew their role to work together as a unit. Now, I would say that there's no time for fun and games, but they always made time to blow some steam off. In between drills, soldiers would do chores just like we do every day. They would cook meals, do laundry, clean gear, and make sure that everything is smooth. Passing the time was done by playing dominoes or poker. Reading was of course a popular way of passing the time as well, but it was a lot harder to get your hands on a book back then, especially when you're running around between marches and battles. So more often than not, soldiers would trade newspapers with their opponents. You would hear about the Christmas peace treaty, but this would happen as well. They would just trade papers. A soldier named Milton Barrett, stationed in the 18th Georgia Volunteers, wrote about this back in 1863. He said, "Our regiment had just come off picket. We stood close together and could talk to each other. Then when the officers were not present, we exchanged papers and bartered tobacco for coffee." They would do it when the officers weren't looking. That's the most intriguing part. They would manage this by using a small boat. Tricky, always a way. The first aerial photograph was back in 1860. James Wallace Black took this photo not by using drones or any bowling alley crazy technology we have today, but rather just a hot air balloon. This lovely landscape is the town of Boston, and you're looking at it from 2,000 feet. This was a long time before selfie sticks. Even longer before that, hot air balloons were being used in warfare. The first account of a hot air balloon being used in war was 1794, when the French Committee of Public Safety created the Corps d'Astrociers, which is a hot air balloon squad. They were used in the Battle of Charleroi and Fleurus, and then 70 years later they were used in the American Civil War. They were pretty large as well. They could fit around 5 guys, where smaller balloons like the Eagle and Excelsior only carried 1 soldier. Those were for stealth flights. That'd be pretty brave. Imagine seeing a hot air balloon coming over the horizon and it has soldiers shooting at you. That's incredible. I didn't hear about any of this growing up. They could reach up to 1,000 feet, so they definitely had a vantage point like no other, and they would communicate with soldiers on the ground using flag signals or of course telegraphs. The most successful balloon program in the Union was under the command of Thaddeus Lowe. He and Lincoln were allies, and Lowe actually sent a telegraph to Lincoln once describing the view of Washington from above. Call your friends more and describe your view to them. You might get a few things done. Number 8. Bounty jumpers. Fewer than 150 Union soldiers were killed for desertion, and Lincoln was actually constantly writing letters and endorsements reducing soldier sentences from death to labor during the war. That's how bad it got. Deserters were a big problem for both the Confederate and Union armies, so it was punishable by death. After the Battle of Fredericksburg, the Union had 100 deserters roughly a day. That's a lot, every single day. The Union actually used peer pressure at one point just to keep soldiers from leaving. In 1863, the Union offered regiment perks if a certain percentage of original men were on for a following tour of duty. So soldiers inside were making others stay on board. How they did that, what they said, we don't know. Bounty jumpers were men who were paid to fill in the spot of newly drafted soldiers. So these guys would join for a few days and then desert them all over again and join a new post as the new substitute and get paid. And of course, some deserters were branded to avoid this problem. Number 7. Daily diet. These soldiers were all around 25 years old. The minimum age to join, of course, was 18, but a lot of these guys who were that young would often lie about their age anyways on paper. So on paper, the average was 25 years. But these guys were kids, basically. They ate mostly crackers, and when I say crackers, I don't mean the salty work snacks that you have today. These were made of like flour and water and just salt called hardtack. They would eat berries, nuts, and fruits. Anything they could find is all they had. Most of these soldiers were close to starving to death. Number 6. Soldiers protest. 1/3 of the Union soldiers were immigrants, and 1 in 10 were African American, and those soldiers actually refused their salaries for 18 months to protest being paid lower wages than white soldiers. When black soldiers were signing up in the Union Army in 1863, they were only getting $10 a month, while white soldiers were getting around $13 a month. Officers were getting $700 a month too. It was just insane. To make things even worse, black soldiers were then hit with a $3 monthly cleaning fee, bringing that down to $7 a month now. So a protest was in order and it was held for 18 months, and then come September 1864, black soldiers received equal pay that was retroactive to their enlistment date, so they finally were able to send money back to their families after that long. Number 5. Passing time. You would assume the Civil War and being part of it and everything I've talked about would give you enough anxiety, but gambling was also a common pastime in between battles. And when I say gambling, I don't mean, okay, it's nighttime, let's throw a few bucks down and play dominoes. No, they would gamble on everything. Horse races, chess, euchre, poker, checkers, cards were popular until the end of the Civil War, when of course they were harder to come by, being so flimsy and all. And when dominoes and cards were out of the picture, soldiers would really go old school and play leapfrog. Yeah, games like that were literally all they had. They would wrestle each other for fun, they would have foot races and bet on them. Bowling would be played using cannonballs to knock down wooden pins, and baseball was also played, but it was a little different back then to how we remember it now. The ball was a lot softer, and there were sometimes only 2 bases. The only way you were out also was if you were hit by the ball, hence the softness that I mentioned. Number 4, coldest winters. With the winter winds rolling in occasionally, soldiers could no longer play baseball outside and peg each other with baseballs, but what you could do was hit each other with snowballs. A little fun, also a little scary. They called it a snow battle. Yeah, a snow battle too. Battle, way more intense. Soldiers would leave with bruises, black eyes, and sometimes even broken bones. Yeah, these guys were blowing off lots of steam, and they would plan attacks and take it obviously seriously, as they did with their daily civil duties. Even officers got in on this action. When pieces of ice were no longer available to large units to throw at one's head, other winter games would include skating and sledding. Number 3. Food March. In April 1863, a group of mostly women led a march to get the governor's attention. The governor at the time, John Letcher, was joined by President Jefferson Davis. It did not end well. The food situation in the South was not great because food prices changed depending on the status of the war. Outcomes of the battle directly affected prices because they were linked to the CSA's currency. That plus the fact that invading troops from the north would often burn crops when they came through, it was getting worse over time. Come April 1863, this march of women broke windows. They flipped carts until eventually they drew out Governor John Letcher and President Jefferson Davis. John Letcher literally started to throw cash at the protesters. Now they still didn't stop, obviously, that didn't solve problems. It was so bad that the militia almost had to open fire. Number 2, the Alligator. I mentioned soldiers and hot air balloons, so I must mention the United States Navy's first submarine. How fun. This 47-foot long submarine that was paddle powered, yep, you heard me, paddle powered, so you'd be inside and you would do this. We can't call it the USS Alligator because it technically didn't see any active days of combat. In fact, the Alligator, that's what I'll call it, had to be cut loose on its first mission. It was being towed behind the USS Sumter on April 2nd, 1863, right off North Carolina when bad weather hit. The Alligator went down and we haven't found it since. It's still out there. The Alligator is still lurking out there. Only a few months after this new weapon went down, the Confederate States of America launched their own sub, the H.L. Huntley, and it sank the USS Housatonic near the coast of Charleston, officially marking the first time a submarine sank an enemy ship. It also immediately sank afterwards, taking the lives of 8 crewmen, so even in victory, you're not safe. They made history but only enjoyed it for minutes. This is all tragic. Number 1. The wage gap. Hundreds of women joined the Civil War and they did so by looking like men. Yeah, they would pull a she's the man and get to work. But the thing is, like I mentioned before with the CSA's currency being affected by the status of the war, soldiers were getting $13 a month roughly. That's double what a woman could make anywhere on the planet, so they really had no choice but to join. This was long before women's suffrage, so if they thought you were a man, you could use that $13 how you wanted. So it comes to no surprise that women would keep this disguise even after the war ended. In 1909, the US Army officially denied that any woman was ever enlisted in the military service of the United States as a member of any organization of the regular or volunteer army at any time during the period of the Civil War. During the Civil War, though, that was the first time in American history when women all came together in a war effort. Thousands of women from the North and South volunteered as nurses.
Number 10. Chop Chop. It's pretty difficult to talk about the Tudors without a little controversy. When you talk about King Henry VIII, for example, it's hard not to talk about him getting divorced, and how he chose to go about it. And if you didn't know, it was beheading, a lovely royal European tradition. Basically, when old Henry wasn't getting his way, or was in heat for someone else's whap, he wanted a divorce, and sometimes the church just wouldn't grant him the separation he was looking for. So, instead, he separated his wife's head from her body, after accusing poor Anne Boleyn of adultery. Poor Anne Boleyn. Number 9. Father Neptune. This might come as a surprise, but Great Britain didn't always have the strongest navy on earth. Henry VIII is considered to be the father of the Royal Navy. He commissioned the construction of many ships, largely increasing the size of the navy. He did his best to find the best shipbuilders and use tax money to fund the project. He also began to set up naval infrastructure and culture, with schools of navigation being opened, and set away lands for docks to improve the effectiveness of the navy. And this was a great start, because when you fast forward a few hundred years, Great Britain had had the strongest navy in the world, and that is what helped them conquer so many lands. Number 8. Fitzroy and Sister. Royal families have weird bloodlines. I'm sure you guys know that by now, but I mean, come on, it's a little crazy. Looking at a royal family tree is like trying to decipher some of my high school essays. You gotta look at it for a while before you know what's going on. Sorry, Mrs. M. We all know that sometimes royals like to do weird things in their love lives, like marrying your sister or your brother to keep the bloodline pure and royal. But forcing your kids to marry because you need a male heir pronto is messed up. Yeah, at one point Henry VIII in his portly glory wanted an heir so bad he was going to make one of his many kids from his many mistresses marry one another. Thank God his son Fitzroy rushed into another marriage, most likely to avoid marrying his half-sister. Why cross the street when you can cross the hall is probably something Henry thought, and you know what? I sent a telegram to the chief last night, it got back to me, told me it wasn't it. Number 7, the royal crane. I relate to this one. Being a big boy is hard sometimes. People might want to pick on you in the schoolyard. You get excited at the sight of food, and the worst noise known to humankind is the Fitness Gram Pacer test is a multi-stage aerobic capacity test that progressively gets more difficult as it continues. Oh yeah, you guys know what I'm talking about. But besides being an overweight teen in high school, King Henry VIII had his own issues. While not being a beefy boy in his youth, once he had become the tyrannical king he's remembered for, well, he wasn't doing P90X. Being the faux chonker that he was, poor King Henry could no longer mount his noble steed without assistance. That assistance would come in the form of a crane would hoist the old boy up and into his saddle. Number 6. You up? I know I'm mad dissing King Henry here, and I know there's other tutors, but this guy's just really messed up. Here's something for our younger audience. We've all been there. So, the King of England had a few wives. Dude must have been slick with the ladies, right? Wrong. Honestly, dude's super cringe. I believe the term used for a man like this would be a waste youth. I bring this up because the love letters he wrote to his mistresses are on the same equivalent as the you up text, which the ladies of my generation will tell you is the most romantic thing a guy could say, especially on a school night at 3 a.m. In one of the love letters to his dearly decapitated Anne Boleyn, he protests the urge to kiss her duckies, which you can probably tell what part of her body that is. It's this part. Number 5, Bloody Mary. Her name isn't Sweet Mary, is it? Yeah, that's right. Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary, Bloody Mary. Oh, we're good. Okay, just checking. Most known for attempts at reversing the English Reformation, tried her very best to restore the papal order, and had over 300 people burned at the stake for being so-called heretics, which, if you ask me, sounds like the worst possible way to die. Mary was overshadowed by her sister, which now coming to think of it, could be the reason why she was so pale. I'm just kidding, but being stuck in someone's shadow sucks. Kinda makes me mad, actually. All of a sudden I want to burn someone alive. Anybody got a match? Number 4. Hey Alexa, can you translate this for me? Being a tutor is a big deal, right? And being on the royal throne of England is also a big deal, right? So obviously our majesty can read and write in English, right? Well, no, actually, he cannot. A more forgettable member of the Tudors is Philip II of Spain. He was the husband of Mary I and was officially recognized as the King of England. To not do so would be considered to be treason. The man also had his face on some coins, and if that's not official, I don't know what is. Someone put me on a coin. However, the biggest irony and the most messed up thing, if you really think about it, is that Philip did not speak or read a word of English. Oftentimes, when he was tending to matters of state, documents had to be printed in either Latin or Spanish in order for him to understand or even act on them. Honestly, if he can get away with that, then I'm proclaiming right now, I'm the king of Iceland. I don't speak Icelandic, but I'm the king. What's up, guys? How you doing? I'm the king now. Number 3, Rebellion Crusher. Henry VII, turns out, wasn't such a great guy either. Having taken the throne after Richard III fell in battle, not everyone was so cool with him taking the reins, as he had a lot of rebellion crushing to do. People were upset. Suppress the rebellion. Can't trust your own court? Suppress them too. As it turns out, he was kind of a mama's boy, and his mother would often influence his political doings. But the worst thing he did was lock up a cousin of his enemies who was only 10 years old at the time. He stayed in this tower locked up until his manual unaliving day at 24. It's just a nice family. Gosh. Number 2, lethal R&D. Sometimes when you're at the top of your game, people want to take you down. A common assassination method in ye olde times was poison. So to prevent that from happening, King Henry and many kings before him had someone testing food for him. But Unlike other kings, King Henry was not just testing his food, but his bed. Yeah, kings were worried that simply touching some poisons was enough to send you to the kingdom in the sky. So, the poor sap who made the king's bed in the morning had to pucker up and kiss his bed, just to make sure that no one had put anything fishy in his bed. The cushion on his chamber pot was also checked before a royal bowel movement. That is so disgusting, okay. Kiss my toilet, peasant! Check for poisons. Sir, did you have pheasant last night? You know what I mean? Number 1, face off. After Queen Elizabeth's face was scarred from smallpox, she wanted the Maybelline look again. Too bad that modern makeup companies didn't exist, because the alternative was just straight messed up. Her makeup was a lovely smelling concoction of vinegar and lead. I'll say that again, vinegar and lead. I don't even know how a human would come to even combine those two together. Lead being lead is toxic, and after being constantly applied to the face like that, well, she didn't live as long as Betty White did. Rest in peace, Betty White. Also, vinegar. Bathing was an issue back in the day, and having vinegar put on your face every day, well, that just must have made her pillows smell like roses. I feel bad for the guys to kiss her bed. Ooh. Number 10. Patterns. Yeah, I don't know about you guys, but I'm starting to notice a pattern. What's that pattern exactly? Well, I'm starting to notice that maybe other Europeans were nicer than at least mainlander ones. I'll get into it. Was Vikings giving their women's rights messed up? No, of course not. I'm not a monster. However, you just gotta understand that a lot of other women in Europe did not share these privileges, like owning property, marriage rights. They even had the right to be warriors. While only a small fraction of women were involved, there are a couple sources that refer to female warriors, such as the War Maidens. Now, mind you, Vikings were coastal raiders, not so much a professional army, but still, it's about the freedoms, so you slay on, Valkyrie warrior, slay on. Number 9, marriage. Okay, well, there was more freedom, but let's be honest, this was a long time ago and not 2022, so not everything was perfect. The marriages were oftentimes arranged by both families and watched over by elders. What's the average age of a bride-to-be, you ask? Well, the bride is a little bit older, and some might call it a midlife crisis, but she's getting married at the age of 13. Lucky number. Sadly, this is just how it went for many civilizations of the day. I'll make the joke again that you don't have that long to live back then, so sure, it makes sense, I guess. Just looking back through the lens of time just makes my skin want to crawl when you do that. Ugh, yucky. I'll stick to the coastal raiding and the pillaging, thanks. Number 8. Grooms, tombs, and drogers. Ladies, wasn't your wedding night beautiful, surrounded by friends and family, a nice meal, and if you've been married long enough, maybe even some bad hair, and tuxedos that went out of fashion the second you walked off the altar. All while being recorded on the first camcorders that were big enough to be bazookas. God, I miss the 70s and 80s. Well, Vikings had some weird things going on too. No, not those bright blue tuxedos. I never understood how that was in style. It was just really weird. Vikings had this tradition where the groom would raid his family's tomb and retrieve a ceremonial weapon. Afterwards, he would take a very hot bath and sweat out the scent of the tomb, I guess? I'm not really sure. Where then his hair was stylized and somewhere a symbol of Thor was placed on him. I don't know about you guys, but that sounds like a lot. I prefer our tradition of drinking too much in the sun before the wedding starts and falling over at the altar. That's a much better one. Number 7, blood. Ladies, if your husband's dungeon crawling wasn't enough to creep you out, then the poor Viking women had more strange traditions for you. The Gothi, or basically a Viking priest, who makes the wedding happen, would often sacrifice an animal in front of the whole wedding to prove that he was capable of commencing a wedding, pouring blood on himself and oftentimes spraying the newlyweds, as it was seen as good for some strange reason. For immediate family, you might want to sit back as you're in the splash zone. And because this is the time before well-taught and understood sanitation, I'm sure there was a grand feast afterwards. I'm sure that won't make anyone sick, right? Number 6, quiet time. You might be thinking to yourself, okay, Big Ched, having blood sprayed on me at my wedding is kind of messed up. But you haven't made your chief joke yet. Does that mean there's something worse than impersonating 1976 Carrie at our wedding? Well, yes there is. And actually, I'm glad you asked. So, when two people fall in love and get married, and maybe have a little bit too much champagne, they go home to put on the final signatures of the marriage. If you catch my drift. Two young lovers dancing the devil's dance in the bedroom sheets for the first time because everybody waits until marriage. However, for Viking women, there's a tradition that us today would be mostly uncomfortable with. Or, I mean, at least if you don't have an OnlyFans, maybe not, I don't know. But when the young couple went back to do what young couples do, they had witnesses. Oh yeah, that's right. At least 6 witnesses apparently, just to make sure things go over smoothly. I moseyed on into town the other day and you know what the chief said? That ain't it. Number 5, housewife. Ladies, I hear ya. No woman wants to be told by a man to cook, clean, and be a housewife. But for Viking wives, this was half the case. Not so much misogynistic as it was just really a necessity. While a lot of Viking life was more than naval raids and pillaging, and while women warriors most likely took part in said pillaging, the women in Viking civilizations did a lot of work at home. Cooking, making clothes, and a whole list of duties that I know I could never do. Truth of the matter is, Vikings were big burly fighters and still required the tender care of a woman. All patriarchy aside, imagine how hard life would have been back then without one another. As for today, I don't think you understand how hard it would be for me personally to sew a hole in my own clothes. Many of underwear have been lost to me, not being able to sew so long underwear. Number 4, score! I heard you work with the companions. What do you do, fetch the mead? That's a Skyrim reference for anyone not sure what that is. It should come as no surprise to anyone that the Vikings enjoyed a little drinky poo once in a while, and by that I mean all the time. Famous for their beers, meads, and wines, Vikings drank to drink. For just about any reason, really. Alcohol played a big role in Viking society, as did in many other civilizations of the past. However, this may have had something to do with the mistreatment of their wives. Think about it for a minute. Has your dad ever been drinking a whole case of beer in the sun on a hot summer weekend, where he then proceeded to say things that he's been thinking but needed the liquor courage to say it? And when he said these things, was it not the most nonsensical thing you ever heard? Well, I'm sure that happened to the Vikings too. Just, it was freezing cold out and the men weren't wearing a fresh pair of white sneakers for mowing the lawn, which doesn't really make any sense when you think about it. This may be why women were allowed to leave marriages if they were mistreated. Number 3, divorce process. Unlike other women in Europe, Viking women had the option to opt out of their marriages. A divorce for other women in Europe may just cost them their lives. Looking at you, King Henry VIII. However, the process of divorcing is rather awkward. Not that I would know, but I feel like a divorce should be somewhat of a private matter. Unless of course you're 90s trailer trash and you end up on Jerry Springer. That ain't my baby! That is not my baby! But even regular folks like you and me can still have their dirty laundry out to air, especially if your marriage is property and children to decide over. While not as messy as daytime television from a forgotten era, the Vikings made their divorces rather public, as that was the divorce process itself. The woman would have to call witnesses to the married bed, or rather just the home, and declare she was divorced. Imagine being pulled off a grueling day's work to be told the lady from the other side of the village is getting divorced. I'm gonna get back to my farm, lady. Jeez. Number 2. Far out, man. As if drinking copious amounts of ale and mead wasn't enough to upset a marriage, how about some recreational use of some wacky substances? Vikings were known for going in a berserker mode when in battle, a seemingly blind fit of rage that would see anyone or anything in the Vikings' way cut down without mercy. There may have been an answer for this aberrant behavior. Mushrooms. Yes, that kind. Some scientists believe that these mushrooms with mind-altering effects grew in areas not too far from the Vikings, and once discovered would lead to some interesting results. Because a large man with a very sharp axe and a belly full of beer is exactly who should be consuming the same kind of mushrooms that may or may not make Pink Floyd's album sound 10 times better. Number 1. Naughty naughty. The chief came sailing into port today and said this isn't it. That's right, I did 2 chief jokes today because that's how messed up this is. Viking men of the past, I'm putting you in the naughty corner, bad Vikings. See, like previously mentioned, Vikings were more than just coastal pirates. They had villages, farms, etc. Just like the rest of Europe. But alas, they did do some pillaging. Oftentimes when going on a raid, one of the many things that was taken from other civilizations and villages was women. Oh yes, not just stocks of gold and grain, but the village's women too. Where they would be taken back to the Vikings, where they would be put into YouTube's least favorite S word for well, you could probably guess what for. Some were married off and some were probably put to work. This is why the Vikings are going in the naughty corner. At least the women could divorce, right? Number 10. Gucci to the socks. Mansa Musa may be the richest human to have ever walked planet Earth. The 9th emperor of the Mali Empire made his massive fortune by exploiting his country's salt and gold production. It is estimated his wealth today would be worth $400 billion US. That is a lot of money. That is a lot of shkarol. It is, however, difficult to place an exact number on his wealth, as this was a very long time ago, and it is difficult to separate his wealth from the actual monarch itself. However, in his travels, in hopes of securing new trade deals, he wanted to show off his good faith and wealth. When he arrived in Mecca, it was time for a shopping spree, where the wealthy king spent so much gold it actually ruined the economy. Yeah, it ruined the economy of Mecca. Honestly, that's just a big Bruce Wayne play right there. Imagine spending so much money, you single-handedly raised the inflation rate in a major city. And also a few others. That wasn't the only place he did it, surprisingly. He also bragged at one point that gold grows like plants where he's from. Where I'm from, it's super cold and there's lots of snow. We aren't selling snow yet, right? Number 9. Bad Vlad. Vlad the Impaler is Vlad the Impaler. Okay, sure, he wasn't the wealthiest king ever and his empire wasn't that big. But listen, I called the chief last night and he said he ain't it. Vlad was best known for his creative punishments, to say the least. Vlad was just the kind of guy who took some folks he didn't like and, impaled them with large wooden or steel stakes. Vlad, he did not discriminate either. While a lot of poor people did end up with the worst suppository ever, he also ended up unaliving some wealthier folk too. This one time at band camp, Vlad had 2 guys come visit, and when he asked them to remove their hats, as was custom in Vlad's kingdom, they refused, which in hindsight was a really bad idea because then Vlad had their hats nailed to their heads so that they may never remove them again. What were poor people going to do? Try and overthrow the guy who left their family members on pikes as some really weird art installation? Truth be told, I've heard too much about this guy for me to even come close to his kingdom. I'm good over here. I don't need to be anywhere near him. You stay over there, I'll be over here, it's all good. Number 8. Return of the Mac. Okay, so you guys know Rome, right? Beautiful ancient city, monuments, aqueducts, a big scary army with red brooms on top of their heads for some reason. Mamma mia, it's beautiful. But it didn't last forever. After many years of conquest and living well, it eventually decayed and sort of split in half, with a west and east. The East becoming known as the Byzantine Empire, which it honestly did pretty well for itself too. This includes the adventures of Basil II. He's nicknamed the Bulgar Slayer. For video games out there, Doomslayer is a big dude in green armor that does what exactly? Slays demons. So that means Basil slays Bulgars. Huh? Yeah, real nice dude. With his financial might and power, he was able to conquer Bulgaria, which lasted a long time actually. And by the time of his death, Basil was the wealthiest man in Byzantine. A classic tale of a man in charge exploiting and pillaging those less fortunate. Number 7. Off with his belly. King Henry VIII was a guy known for a few shady things. Removing your wife's head because you want a new wife isn't exactly the nicest way to go about divorce. I could think of some nasty other stuff too. I know what the I'm saying. I think what was rather more interesting, however, was the king's diet and the quality of life divide between royalty and peasants, especially compared to the average person at the time. Sure, he was the king, but the list of foods and menus that were available to him were crazy, even by today's standards, almost rivaling the wealthy of today. His banquets would often include pork, chicken, fish, goose, beef, fruit, bread, and desserts galore. Extravagant desserts with beautiful designs. And of course, you gotta have some wine to wash that all down with, which funny enough might have made them healthier to drink wine since water purification at the time wasn't so great. It is said he was consuming way more than the average person's calorie intake. Also, not to mention his food was fresh, or as fresh as it could be for the time. And if it wasn't, it was seasoned and preserved with very expensive spices from the far reaches of the globe. Spices that no normal person can get their hands on. The average person may not have been starving, but the quality of food and lack of fresh proteins show you what the almighty gold coin can do. Could someone please pass me the turkey? Number 6. The Cowardly Lion. Richard I was the King of England for a decent amount of time, but didn't spend a lot of time of it in England. He spent most of his time raising taxes so he could fund his international warmongering. After all, that's kind of what history is about. History doesn't usually remember the times we were super friendly and got along. Which brings us to the Crusades! After recapturing Acre in 1191, his enemy Saladin was considering options. of what to do next, and also considering prisoner swaps, which actually was common for the time. Sadly, Saladin may have been taken too long, or may have been planning a retake of the city, because Richard had waited too long. Not sure what Saladin was up to, he took prisoners from Acre who were poor civilians and soldiers up onto a nearby hill in full view of Saladin and slaughtered 3,000 people. He's remembered for being Richard the Lionheart for his bravery. All I'm saying is that it's not very brave to kill innocent poor civilians. War is hell, I guess. Number 5. Nothing is true. Everything is permitted. The Medici family didn't exactly live around the medieval times, but fairly close. That being said, the family is something similar to the Kardashians of today. No, not a hit reality show based around wealthy women who sit around their mansion all day looking for a good verbal argument. No, but rather a well-known family who had extreme wealth and as time went on gained a lot more wealth and power. The Medici got their wealth by being successful bankers. And when you got money, you got power. And they owned a lot of property and had clients in multiple cities. Some family members would later become royalty like Catherine de' Medici, and even more powerful by some family members becoming next to the Lord himself as the Pope. Which, if you're into that sort of thing, you would know how serious that position really is. What I'm getting at is, you don't get that powerful without breaking a few eggs. They used money and power to manipulate, and they got their way. Number 4. Diaper Sniper. Alright. This one's messed up, but that's just how things were. Marriage is a beautiful matrimony between two loving people that has a harmonious, lasting lifetime. Tell that to people in divorce court and see where that gets you. While we may marry for love today, things were a little bit different back in ye olde times. Marriage was oftentimes a business opportunity or a peace treaty of sorts, and other versions of marriage would have you on a certain Dateline show with Chris Hansen. I'm talking about girls getting married at the old refined age of 12. Yuck. It's just how it was. At the time, that was considered the age of maturity, but I mean, if you only live until you're 35, it kinda makes sense, I guess. While most of these cases are from poor people, at the end of the day, they were women and simply could not own business and property that men could. So it's in the best interest that a wealthy man marries a poor girl. Gotta do what you gotta do, I guess. Number 3. Dyslexia for cure found. I don't know about you guys, but sometimes reading can be really hard. You've seen my blooper reel. I mean, I went to school, I got my grade 10, and that's really cool. Maybe soon I'll be able to go to college and get my PFD. But I wasn't a big fan of school, I just like to hang out with my friends. But then again, I did have the opportunity to attend school. The same cannot be said for poor peasants in the medieval age. Some wealthy kings would go as far as to ban the serfs from learning to read. Wouldn't want your population to be too smart, they might overthrow you after all. And sorry ladies, that means you aren't going either. Schools were boys clubs, no girls allowed. The richest of families could have their son sent off to be a squire and eventually enter knightship for their royal throne. But this was for the very rich. I can't help but think that I would look good in all that metal armor though. Give me a sword, a shield, noble steed. Assuming the wealthy would let me go to school. Please sir, could I learn to read? Number 2. Do you require a bowel movement, sir? Kings will be kings, and sometimes they do some things that shouldn't be things. Meet the royal groom of the stool, a man who must follow the king around with a ye olde porta potty, or really just a bowl, where he would be ready to assist the royal in a release of his bowels. Originally created by King Henry VIII, the groom's job was to assist the king with a box to relieve himself, also carrying towels and water, even monitoring the outcome of such daily events. After all, he's the king, gotta keep tabs on his diet. It's also rumored that the kings may have even required assistance in hygiene after the fact. Which, I mean, come on, I know we all need help sometimes, but that's a tad much. With all the disease and not hand washing at the time, I'm not really sure anyone ate food ever again. Number 1. Dead end job. Wiping a royal bum is tough, but cleaving a man's head from his body kinda sucks too. The rich uphold the law, and that means when it's time for the death penalty, somebody's gotta do it. Somebody with less money and somebody who might not have a choice, as professional unalivers at the time often were handed down the blood-soaked acts of their kin. On one hand, you have law and order that is respected. On the other hand, you have a profession that sees law and order through, but is not that well respected. Makes sense that the job kinda sucks though. Unalivers often had to practice their skills and eventually work their way up to the real McCoy, practicing on pumpkins, animals, and eventually criminals. If they got it wrong, i.e. too many swings of the axe, people would rush and attack their unaliver. Despite what movies and cartoons may make you think, these people did have empathy for what they were doing, and because of their social status, a lot of them lived lonely lives. Number 10. Not till the fat lady sings. Most people would be delighted to know that a war is over. War sucks, it's expensive, costs lives, and come on man, it just sucks. Officially, North and South Korea have not signed a peace treaty. That's right. Although they both agreed to an armistice in 1953, on solid paper, there's no surrender, which technically means they're still at war. This sounds bad, but it can't be, right? Not as if tensions between these two could ever be high. It's not as if they're scheming of ways to undermine each other and just waiting for an excuse to open the biggest can of whoop ass at a minute's notice, right? Everything's fine. I don't know if everything's fine. Number 9. Up and down. The Korean War was a great military success and everyone went home happy. Very nice, great success. Just kidding, actually. It didn't really solve anything. What's so messed up is everyone just kinda ended up where they started. North Korea had pushed into the south, almost making it all the way south, when the very effective UN organized a police force of multiple nations, mostly US, and punched their way back up to the 38th parallel. But maybe we better go further, ballsy General MacArthur Douglas said to himself, admiring his own reflection in the mirror, pushing their way all the way up to the Chinese border, where 250,000 Chinese soldiers helped the UN force by pushing them back down to the 38th parallel, putting everyone in the same position they were in the beginning. It's almost as if war was the pointless cost of life. Nah, that can't be, right? No. Number 8. Nuclear threequel. This one is kinda scary, honestly. So, during the Korean War's impression of snakes and ladders, game of borders, and front lines changing like the wind, General MacArthur was getting frustrated with the progress, or lack thereof. He wanted a quick solution. Something that would bring a swift end to the conflict, all while flexing a little muscle in the process. Being a big fan of how the US annihilated 2 cities in Japan in the previous war, he proposed that America once again just start dropping nukes Fallout style. While this was being considered, it was ultimately a no-calzone situation, as I like to call it, for the US and the UN. Soviet Russia had just figured out the recipe for nuclear bombs, and would not hesitate to send one their way in return. The US had lost its nuclear monopoly and ushered in the age of mutually assured destruction. And thank God they didn't, to be honest. I love playing the Fallout games, but that doesn't mean I actually want to be in them. Nah, thanks, man. I'm good. I'm good, dude. Number 7. I need a hero. When we all tell stories, we like to tell stories with heroes and villains, beginnings, middles, ends, rising actions, climax, and conclusion. Bad guy hurts good guy perseveres, and he beats bad guy. Credits roll as the hero walks off into the sunset. Now, I'd like to tell you that the Korean War was a tale of good versus evil. But it's more like bad versus evil. Korea was split between Communist North, supported by China and the Soviet Union. The South was supported by the UN and the US. Each has their own dictator wanting to unify Korea in their own image. Yes, the communists were not very nice, but the right-wing dictator installed by the US was arguably just as bad. So in short, a super awesome time to be in Korea. Number 6. Tootsie Slide. This one goes out to all the fans of MacGyver, you're gonna love this one. So during a very cold segment of the Korean War known as the Chosen Mountain, nicknamed Frozen Chosen by the very cold Marines that were stationed there, temperatures were below -25°C and morale was lower. Well, actually their ammo count was. So the Marines radioed in an airdrop for Tootsie Rolls, which was just a code name they'd given to mortar shells. Apparently the radio operator receiving this message did not understand this, and the actual chocolate candy Tootsie Roll was airdropped to the Marines instead. Yeah. Not wanting to waste this processed American delicacy, Americans went full MacGyver and discovered that once chewed and placed in bullet holes or in things that needed to be filled, the treat made for a decent enough repair. If women don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. Number 5. Stranger Danger. We all know if there's a van that rolls up to your neighborhood and there's a man inside offering free candy, it's gonna be a bad time. Well, North Korea might have had the biggest and baddest van in the neighborhood, as it's estimated that 84,000 people were kidnapped during the war. That is so many people. Why was North Korea putting so many faces on the side of milk cartons, you ask? Well, it was mainly a forced repopulation tactic, which again is so messed up, I can't even begin to tell you how wrong that is, but also may have been the beginning of a super secret spy program, where North Korea was interested in having biracial spies, making it easier to infiltrate the enemy. Just one of many nefarious activities North Korea has been up to. There is no spy program in North Korea, and I am not saying, I am absolutely saying this of my own free will. Please do not send help. Number 4, not actually a war. While there were a lot of bang bang shooty shooty killy killy during the Korean War, technically it wasn't really a war, even though it feels like one. Being referred to as a police matter. Yeah, the US sent a lot of troops to fight this not war, which in case you're wondering how that's possible, you can take a look at Congress, as Congress never declared war, setting a new precedent. Although, after the millions of dollars spent, the loss of thousands of soldiers on each side, plus the UN force being comprised of 16 other nations, I'm not exactly sure how it's not a war. That's like me saying, I did not do my English essay because it's not an English essay. It's a 2-page opinionated piece that should be 4 pages, but I didn't read the book and just used Cliff Notes. Sorry, Mrs. M. I mean, come on, can you blame me? Have you ever actually tried to sit down and read Lord of the Flies? Not in a school setting? I called the chief last night, you know what? He said it wasn't it. Number 3, Top Gun. Ask any military history guru or anyone who's got a thing for it and they will tell you that after World War II, military tech was about to get a little crazy. On September 8th, 1950, something a little spicy happened in regards to both military and aviation history. The world's first all-jet dogfight took place. Americans in F-80s and communists piloting the infamous MiG. Despite a movie that I actually think isn't very good, this wasn't great for the Americans. Yes, they did end up shooting down the enemy, but it was clear that the MiG was outperforming the F-80. Forced American aviation to come up with something just a little bit better. Come on guys, you can do it. Number 2, just in case. So it's been years since the Korean War. They've been split in half. DMZ is there. Everything's kosher, right? Well, not exactly. If you followed the news in recent years, you know that North Korea has been doing some unsavory testing with ballistic missiles. However, what some people may not know, and it's kind of messed up when you think about it, is to this day there is still a large number of US soldiers stationed in South Korea. 30,000 to be exact. A remnant from the Korean War, but something that many would consider to be a necessity given the hostile nature of the North Korean regime. Hopefully things stay in a stalemate and don't escalate. We got enough problems on our hands right now. On a side note, there's also a large concentration of US soldiers in Japan as well. Not directly related to the Korean War, but they are in close proximity just in case anything sneaky happens. Okay. Number 1, big boom, little changes. World War I changed lives. It dissolved century-old empires, completely redrew the map. World War II doesn't happen without World War I, and it was so bad, the whole world swore to never let that happen again. Heck, even wars from centuries ago had more cause and effect. The Korean War is very different in this regard. Like previously mentioned, the communists were bad, but the capitalists were not much better. While the lines may not be as blurred as some wars, the outcome was completely different to what most people were used to. When World War II ended, there was cheering in the streets. When the Korean War ended, there just wasn't much to show for it, besides a tragic loss of life, debt, and a new theory about communism that would literally make the exact same thing happen in Vietnam 15 years later. Seriously, the comparisons are uncanny. It's like the exact same thing. Crazy. Number 10, the mask. Probably the most interesting thing about the plague doctors is their mask. Why such a weird shape? I always thought it looked like a crow. Crows and ravens share a lot of iconography with dying and sickness and just bad things in general, which always felt like bad marketing to me. Doctors shouldn't look like that. Anyway, the masks actually did serve a purpose, as they were kinda onto something. The bubonic plague was one of the worst sicknesses the world has ever seen, considering the methods of dealing with such were barbaric compared to today. The masks were designed so nothing could get in, and even had glass eye fixtures like a gas mask. More importantly, at the end of the mask was a beak, or so we'll call it, and a little area where you could put nice smelling herbs and aromas to counteract what was probably the worst smells imaginable. A lot of corpses make for a bad smell. To add insult to injury, the mask may have got its design from satirical theater. Oh, what cruel irony. Number 9, 39.5-foot pole. A compliment to the gothic clothing that they wore and creepy mask, of course, the plague doctors also had a cane. And for once in history, it wasn't a beating stick, right? It was a way of poking and prodding patients who were quite ill from a distance. As if your doctors get sick, well then you're in trouble. But the idea here again is to keep your distance from people, as they had figured out that the plague was quite contagious. Did I say the cane was not used to beat people? Yeah, I pulled a sneaky on you. They did. Sometimes they had to use them to ward off crowds of people desperately seeking medical attention. Hordes of people like your least favorite zombie movie. It was a very dangerous job at the time. And as many New Yorkers say, somebody gotta do it. Number 8. The treatments. Surprise, surprise, the treatments for the bubonic plague were not ideal. Well, at least for my tastes. Bloodletting. Someday I'll have to tell you guys the crazy stories that have happened to me and blood. I don't do well with it. I don't know why. You can probably imagine the kind of kid I was. I was a little tank. I used to get cuts, scrapes, bruises all the time. No problem. Blood was the least of my worries and the third most concerning body fluid to find in my clothes. But these days, a drop of blood could have me horizontal on the floor. That's why I say no to bloodletting. Based on the 4 humors, blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile, and the balance of such liquids. So releasing some of the blood should balance out the equilibrium, right? That's what they thought. I say no. Leave my blood alone. Number 7. The treatments part 2. Well, as if having a man in a very scary mask with a large stick who strongly smells of mint draining you of your precious life juice wasn't the worst part of your day, then perhaps the other offerings he had up his sleeve will ruin your day. Some patients were instructed to pull up Bear Grylls and drink the forbidden lemonade. That's pee in case you were wondering. Bumps and boils would be poked and prodded at. Sometimes toads were rubbed all over you. Okay. Lancing the bubbles that formed on the skin, because that's what happens with the plague, inducing vomiting and diarrhea, and of course the ye olde tried and true treatment of mercury, because yes, consuming a liquid metal has to cure me of this awfulness, right? I'm sure it won't make me feel worse because it's poison or anything. Number 6. Healers to all. Despite the wealthy doing their best to stay wealthy and not to be poor, avoiding disease in ye olde times was something that they just couldn't dodge. Yes, today the wealthy live better than a lot of people, but the modern average person also lives better than most royalty of the past. Sure, they had access to warm, dry clothes, shelter, better food, hygiene, and a lot of things commoners just didn't. Education for me is the big one there. You gotta learn to read. However, there's still a common denominator, and that's sickness. The plague did not care who or what you are. Still doesn't today. Rich or poor, happy or sad, you can, and if it's the past, most likely will get sick. So the plague doctors had to treat everyone. The statistics of how many people lost their lives to the bubonic plague are staggering. Seriously, look it up, it's a crazy number. Number 5. Data collection. Unlike Facebook and Google and maybe some hackers spying on your data, that's a bad thing. Plague doctors learning about and collecting data was a good thing. Yes, the plague doctors very well could have been coming up with some of the first serious medical documents. At least, well, in a modern sense. What treatments worked? What didn't? Sadly not much. Patients who were healed and cured and others who didn't make it. That list was a lot longer, unfortunately. Despite their unusual treatments, this data collection and trying to zero in on what works and what doesn't was a big part of the job. A job that I know I could never do. Number 4. Outcasts. Chances are that your family is made up of folks who work in different industries or professions. You probably got an uncle that has something to do with trucks. Maybe your aunts are nurses. Maybe you got some important family members who work in Washington, D.C. or Ottawa. Ooh, fancy. But my point being, even though they all do different things, or maybe even think differently, you can all come together and be a family, especially over a meal. Love a good meal. Plague doctors did not have this and might have been a little lonely, which is sad because they had a really tough job. But basically, because they spent most of the time with infected patients, more than anyone else really, sometimes even they would get sick. This created a sense of mistrust, as sometimes they could be seen as a source of the infection, or the bad air, as it was so commonly called. When employed, they were told not to socialize with commoners. If the last 2 years have taught us anything, it's that I love people and I want to be around them. Come on, hang out, it'd be great. Number 3. Autopsies. Yes, the doctors of the Black Plague also had some autopsies to perform, which honestly, straight up, I can't imagine was a good idea. I mean, the whole no hand washing thing and like the piles of bodies everywhere, it just couldn't be good for everyone's health. So why bother opening any of them up? Just leave them be. Get a fire going maybe, you can deal with it that way, you know what I'm saying? All I'm saying is it ain't no secret why these folks with all the smelly pustules were dropping off. However, in addition to the data collection, this was important as it gave literally almost a limitless supply of practice. I mean, experience. to see what makes us tick. Was it a boom in modern medicine? No, not really. But like a lot of medicine and science we understand today, we had to break a few eggs to get our omelet, or in this case, carve out a few chest cavities. Man, the convoy of carriages needed to carry out those bodies must have been crazy. No thanks. Number 2. Pray it away. Plague doctors were doing their best with what they had, and in their defense, that wasn't much. But a lot of times back in the day when people thought things went wrong, it was the wrath of God. I mean, what else could it be, right? And for the people at the time, a lot of things went wrong. There's a flood that destroyed your crops. Must be God. Your wife passed away in childbirth. Had to be God. A sickness that's making lots of real estate go up for sale because of the lack of people due to them not breathing anymore. That has to be God. So people needed to do something to please God and make amends. How about whipping yourself for your sin? Yeah, that's right, that's where we're going with this, and they did it. People were whipping themselves to show just how sorry they were. I mean, hey, at least it wasn't like the Aztecs who maybe took it a little too far. Just walking around flogging yourself all day. Flog. Just doing one of the whipping yourself in the back. Number 1, scapegoats. Sadly, in times of great horror and sadness, you'd think people would come together, work towards a common goal. A disease that threatens the very fabric of human civilization. Well, that has to be the work of God, or maybe it's a certain group or groups of people that the church or government doesn't approve of. Yes, that's right, scapegoats, the blame game. While a scapegoat really can be anything, it sadly oftentimes ends up being a group of people who get targeted simply because it's easier than dealing with the truth. Not cool, guys, not cool.